Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Matt Reese, GreenGov Deputy Director, and today's webinar is co-hosted and supported by the GreenGov Council and Penn State Sustainability Institute. The GreenGov Council was established by the Governor's Executive Order 2019-01, which requires Commonwealth agencies to lead by example, promoting energy, conservation, and sustainable governance. The executive order sets goals for the Commonwealth, including the goal of achieving 26% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 and an 80% reduction by 2050. The executive order created specific goals for agencies on fleet electrification, high performance buildings, annual energy reductions, and use of renewable electricity. Visit our website at www.dgs.pa.gov/greengov to see how agencies are meeting these goals. You will find our 2020 annual report, which is a roll-up of the entire program of results and achievements from last year. Also, there's a place to sign up for our GreenGov quarterly newsletter. We have posted our third, in later news, we have posted our third version of the GreenGov agency certification checklist on the website as well. The checklist is filled out by Commonwealth agencies on an annual basis to gauge their efforts on sustainability initiatives. Now, I'd like to introduce our partner at the Penn State Sustainability Institute, Peter Boger. Peter Boger is the Assistant Director for Community Engagement at Penn State University's Sustainability Institute and is responsible for developing strategic programming and partnerships that help Penn State leverage its resources to promote sustainability throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you all so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have everybody here, and we're excited for this great talk by Devin and Greg. We're also really pleased to be partnering with the GreenGov Council. The Sustainability Institute at Penn State has a similar mission to the GreenGov Council in that we are not the owners of sustainability at Penn State, we are the facilitators. So much the same way that the GreenGov Council doesn't own sustainability for the state government, but instead facilitates it across all the different departments. We are seen as a mandate to help institutionalize sustainability across Penn State's teaching, research, student engagement, operations, and community engagement. And to that end, we're happy to be partnering on this GreenGov series as a way to really advance the state's land grant mission to serve and partner with community groups around the state and advance on Pennsylvania's sustainability. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to today's talk.
All right, thanks, Peter. Now I'll introduce our guest speakers for this afternoon, Devin Pennebaker and Greg Knerr. Devin Pennebaker is the Energy Procurement Team Manager for the Penn State Facilities Engineering Institute and oversees energy price risk management activities, including the procurement of electricity and natural gas commodity for PSFEI's clients. In addition to coordinating energy procurement activities for an energy portfolio of $350 million spread across 10,000 client accounts, he guides the software development efforts of PSFEI's proprietary energy risk management application, IRMA, and serves on PSFEI's sustainability team. Next will be Greg Knerr, who is the commodity manager with the Pennsylvania Department of General Services Bureau of Procurement, specializing in energy supply management. Greg oversees the contracting processes that satisfy the varying energy needs of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's agencies, including on-road fuels, various heating fuels, and $140 million worth of competitively bid electricity and natural gas supply contracts. In this role, Greg also assists policymakers and agency personnel in shepherding renewables and other energy-related projects through the complex public procurement processes. All right, take it away, Devin.
All right, Greg, you want to start us off with the next slide here? And one more. All right. Well, good afternoon, and thank you to Matt and Mark of the GreenGov Council and Peter from the Sustainability Institute. It's an honor to be here and invited here to talk about some of the things that are really near and dear to us these days. So running down the agenda, I'll be covering some of the basics of electricity and electric deregulation in a nutshell, and then layering in a discussion about renewable energy certificates. Then I'll turn it over to Greg Knerr from the Department of General Service Bureau of Procurement to unpack power purchase agreements and the Pennsylvania Pulse Project. Let's go next slide. Thanks. So let's start off by talking about some of the basics. In general, in our region, we'll try to keep this relative to Pennsylvania for the most part and our region. There are three components of electricity that we focus on. I'm sure anybody who's studied this will immediately recognize generation, transmission, and distribution. Generation, we generally refer to as the actual electrons produced from generation plants through various methods and various means. You can see solar energy, mechanical energy, and turning that directly into electricity. Think of hydro or wind power in that case, or some of the traditional energy sources that take something, make heat from it, and then use the steam from that to turn it into mechanical energy and turn that into electricity. So nuclear, coal, natural gas, any of those generation types in that sense. Transmission, that we just basically refer to as the movement of high voltage electrons from generation plant to either substation or the distribution company. So high voltage movement with low losses across long and great distances for transmission. Distribution, there we refer to as taking that high voltage electricity and transforming it to lower voltages for your homes or for your businesses. And just for clarity, whenever we talk about distribution or distribution companies, we generally refer to them as utility companies. And in our industry, that company acts as the primary billing entity, handles the disaster response, and really ensures local grid reliability. They have those primary responsibilities. So just starting out with a little bit of terminology ahead of time, when we talk about utility, we're generally referring to that distribution company. Next slide, Greg. So let's start off with a little bit of a discussion about electricity deregulation. When Pennsylvania was a regulated state, those three components of generation, transmission, and distribution were vertically integrated and controlled by one single company. When Pennsylvania deregulated the electricity industry, the Public Utility Commission oversaw the breakup of the generation component, empowering residents, companies, and institutions to choose who provided that generation service. Consumers are now given the choice of entering into a contract to receive generation service from an entity known as an electricity generation supplier, or they can do nothing and still receive what we call default service from that utility company. The point here is the consumers now have the power to actually make that choice of who supplies those that energy. One important note to make and important point here is that just because we say deregulation, it doesn't mean that everyone and anything can do whatever they want. The Public Utility Commission still regulates the utility companies, so those folks who provide bills and control the actual wires, as we want to call them, the wires companies. And they also do set guidelines and policies that suppliers from the deregulated side must follow to ensure that consumers really aren't taken advantage of. Next slide there. The degrees of deregulation or not deregulated regulation and the market structure and applicability of those who are eligible to shop their energy supply vary from state to state. So to that end, here's a map of the deregulated energy states across the continental United States and some of Canada. And, it's interesting to see that Pennsylvania is just one state where both electricity and natural gas supply are both deregulated. So that offers our Pennsylvania consumers an opportunity. Next slide, please. The Department of General Services and the Bureau of Procurement, Greg's office, and Greg in particular, with PSFEI's assistance, try to seize that opportunity to solicit energy supply from a pool of qualified suppliers with the goals of providing low-priced energy and stable energy pricing for the Commonwealth agencies that DGS and PSFEI serve, while also trying to capture low pricing in the markets and passing those savings on. Hence the graphic here showing potential savings. By choosing an electricity supplier, consumers can potentially save money over the utility's default rate that I talked about, or they can choose a supplier that provides energy from renewable sources or sometimes both. How do energy suppliers provide this renewable energy? Well, let's talk about renewable energy certificates, or RECs as we'll call them, and dive into that just a little bit here. Next slide, Greg. Thank you. Excellent DJ here. So along the lines of renewable energy certificates, we'll talk about really what is a REC, how are they tracked, and what do RECs actually mean for your institution or your facility or your organization that you're working with. Next slide here. All right, a little bit of nomenclature to start off with and clean up here. Oftentimes we'll hear renewable energy credits or renewable energy certificates, and a lot of people have the question of, well, is there a difference? No, it's pretty much the same thing. They both refer to the same, we'll call it an instrument for the time being here. How are they defined? Well, let's go with the EPA, and we typically just cite the top authority on things here. So let's look at the EPA's definition. Renewable energy certificate, or a REC, is a market-based instrument that represents the property rights to the environmental, social, and other non-power attributes of the renewable energy generation. RECs are issued when 1 megawatt hour or 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity is generated and delivered to the electricity grid from a renewable energy source. It's a very book-wise definition, but one of the big points in there that's underlined that we really want to key in on is that attribute word. We'll talk about that in a minute here and why that is the absolute most important part of a renewable energy credit. But let's clean up one more difference first before we really dive into that attribute discussion. Next slide, Greg. A lot of times we hear and see information about CO2 offsets, and we wanted to cover a little bit about what's the difference there. It's a question that a lot of people have, and really the definition here, and we take most of this stuff from the from Scope 2 guidance, if that means anything to you folks out there. But offsets and their global avoided emissions claim represent a different instrument and claim from the energy attributes associated with energy production. Offsets convey tons of avoided CO2 using project level accounting, but they do not convey information about direct energy generation emissions occurring at the point of production, like contractual instruments or RECs do. An offset credit does not confer any claims about the use of electricity attributes applicable to what we call Scope 2. So for anyone that's familiar with the term Scope 2, the distillation of that is that offsets may not provide sufficient coverage to reduce your Scope 2 greenhouse gas claims. It's a little bit heady, but something for anybody out there who is familiar with greenhouse gas claims. Next slide, please, Greg. So I said we talk about this attribute word and what it means. So here we are. This was taken. This graphic shows a sample wind generator. In the industry, there are really sort of two components of energy that's produced. There's the electrons themselves, which sort of represent the what of generation, and then there's the attribute, which represents the how. Keeping those two separate is important here. The attribute is what's conveyed in the form of a REC and can be bundled into an energy contract or power purchase agreement that Greg will talk about, or it can be unbundled and sold on the open market, while the null power, as we call it, or just the electrons, is sent directly into the grid. The key point in all of this is that the REC, or the attribute, is what gives the holder the ability to claim the how, or the generation method. Again, to drive that home, the REC, by holding the REC, you claim the renewable part of the energy generation. Next slide, please, Greg. So one question that might enter your mind is, who tracks these? So there are all these different generation plants out there in the continental United States, but really who tracks and keeps information on these renewable energy credits? The answer is it's all pretty much regional tracking. So in New York, there's a generation tracking system. In our region, the PJM as we call it, there's a tracking system there. Texas, they have their own as well. To give you an idea of who tracks those, Greg, would you flip to the next slide here? This is very small and extremely difficult to read. However, the point is that they're tracking their renewable energy certificate or credit tracking systems all across North America, across the continental United States, and into Canada. So these things, these credits and these attributes are tracked by someone, not just somebody having the, not just by another faceless entity across the digital divide. Next slide, please, Greg. So we decided to add in here really one of these, what this means to you in RECs. Best way to do that is in the form of a Q&A. Can you use RECs to fulfill a 100% renewable energy procurement goal? And the answer we took directly from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, those Scope 2, as I referred to them earlier, guidelines. And the actual section, I won't get into that, but the actual section basically states that location-based assessment of production on the grid or a company's contractual procurement using instruments that convey a claim to consumers regarding the resource identity and use. So that's really all they reference as far as whether you can use RECs to fulfill your renewable energy procurement goal. In this case, that basically leads us to believe that yes or no, depends on how you as an entity and you as a corporation, you as a consumer decide to account for your greenhouse gas emissions. All right, next slide here. We'll turn it over to Greg to talk about PPAs, the different types, and how you really can incorporate those RECs into PPAs, and how the Commonwealth did that.
Apologize for that technical glitch there. Can Devin, am I live here? I was muted and I had to back out to unmute myself.
You are live.
All right. Excellent. All right, so building on what Devin had covered, I'm going to dive into a little bit about the different types of contractual instruments you can use to enter into what we call power purchase agreements, PPAs for short. PPAs are long-term supply agreements that are used to facilitate construction of solar PV installations. At least that's what we're focused on today. They can really be used to facilitate the construction of any type of renewable installation, but our focus has been on solar for the last several years. So those can be done both on-site or off-site. On-site solar PPAs, they typically will involve, well, on-site implies that it's going to be on your property. That will most likely involve some sort of land lease through a solar developer. And I suppose you could do it where you just, have it built on your behalf and you can own, operate, and maintain it. if that was something that you would want to do. But for a governmental organization, that really screws up the economics of the thing, because then you lose all the ability to take advantage of tax credits. So typically, that's why these installations are done through this lease type of arrangement. So there's two different ways that you could do it, and a lot of it depends on your size. In Pennsylvania, we have something called net metering. Rule of thumb is it applies to projects 3 megawatts in output or less. There are some caveats and exceptions to that depending on which utility you're served by, but rule of thumb would be 3 megawatts. So what net metering means, it's very similar to the type of circumstances you would be operating under if you were, say, installing solar panels on your roof of your house. Up to 3 megawatts, the utility company is required to take the generation output from anything that you install behind your meter, so to speak. So anything that you install in your home that reduces your energy use, the utility is required to take that generation and pay you whatever their going rate is for it. So under those circumstances, it's the way it's usually explained is when you're using power more than you're producing, your meter's spinning forward, and when you're producing more power and exporting it out basically into your utility system, your meter is spinning backwards. So you're reducing your use commitment, or how much you're buying from your utility each month. So for larger installations, when you have something installed that is more than that 3 megawatt net metering limit, that's where you start to get into wholesale market activities with PJM in Pennsylvania. You have to interconnect with the power grid, and you will need a wholesale power agent, usually an electric supplier or some other energy management firm that would act as an intermediary on your behalf and deal with all the work necessary to move power from your facility or your house or your location, your institution, to the power grid. And that there's a cost associated with doing that and operating in the wholesale market that, depending on your circumstances, it might make sense, and in other circumstances, maybe not. All right, off-site power purchase agreements are typically referred to as virtual PPAs. They are usually large, what we would refer to as utility scale sites constructed on privately owned land. They provide economies of scale just based on the size of the locations and the amount of generation that you're getting from each of those locations. So as far as the different types of supply options there, because you are very much involved in wholesale transactions, when you're doing these large utility scale projects, same thing as what I just described for the on-site projects, you need to involve a wholesale agent to operate on your behalf to move the power from where it originates to your locations, and then also handle any sort of excess power available based on whatever the terms of the contract, however that's supposed to operate. Each one can be a little bit different depending on how you negotiate. Another option that we're seeing starting to pop up is to do these large off-site virtual power purchase agreements through the retail marketplace. And the retail marketplace for electricity is the marketplace that Devin described in one of his first few slides, where you have an energy supplier who delivers power to the utility on your behalf. The power still is distributed to you through the utility company. But that's more of the retail marketplace is the traditional electric supply arrangement that you would enter into if you were selecting a power supplier for your home. There are some pluses and minuses to doing a PPA through the retail marketplace, and we'll touch on that here when I talk about the PA Pulse contract. When you have these retail arrangements, really the PPA is between your supplier and their developer. So you as the end user, you're not involved in the agreement, the direct agreement for the construction of the site. You can have some say, a little bit of say in how they do that, depending on how involved you want to get into specifying construction requirements and siting and things like that. But you would not be directly involved in the actual power purchase agreement per se between the supplier and the developer. You are really entering into a long-term power supply contract, which again has its goods and its bads, and we'll touch on that here. So as far as power purchase agreements and SRECs, which are solar renewable energy certificates or credits, with a PPA, there's really two main options, and I suppose there's different ways you can slice and dice each one, but for the most part, you either allow your developer to retain those SRECs and monetize them as they see fit. And the good side of that is the value of those SRECs, because your supplier or your PPA contractor will retain those, then that should in theory reduce your price per kilowatt hour for your contract. The flip side of that, and builds on what Devin was explaining earlier about RECs in general, because you are not taking the RECs, you have no authority to claim the renewable attributes from that solar power installation. So somebody else somewhere is buying the renewable attributes of that power that was generated, whether it was an on-site or a virtual PPA, but a solar installation that you facilitated the construction of, you cannot claim the solar benefits from that because you did not claim those SRECs. So the other side of that is you include the SRECs in your purchase, you have them retired on your behalf, and then really the opposite is true. You get to claim the renewable benefits of that power. The negative is there's a cost associated. That's really it, and it just depends on how you would want to set that up, what goals you're trying to achieve. It really would be dictated by whoever the end user is, which way you would go in this equation here. So a little bit on some real high level bullet points on the PA Pulse contract. I'm sure many of you are aware, back in late March, the governor's office announced that the Commonwealth has entered into a long-term contract with Constellation Energy that will result in the construction of 191 megawatts of new in-state solar capacity in Pennsylvania. Those will be constructed here over the next year or so and will be online by January of 2023. It's a 15-year agreement. It's an off-site virtual PPA, essentially between Constellation and Lightsource BP, who happens to be the same developer that is working on the Penn State solar contract that was recently instituted. So that's going to be at 7 sites located across 6 central Pennsylvania counties. There's 2 locations in York County and then several scattered about some other counties north of Harrisburg that will be announced here in the coming months. So just some general details still. This contract for electric utility accounts across 16 agencies.
Greg, I think we're having a connection problem with you. Greg, are you still with us?
Can you folks still hear me? I'm having some connection issues here.
Yeah, we lost you just as you flipped the slide, Greg.
Okay, all right. So I'll go back and this current slide.
Yes, this current
Okay,
slide.
thanks. All right. Sorry, we had a VPN cut out here. So as I was saying, some details on the PA Pulse contract. That agreement will provide 100% solar power to 434 of the Commonwealth's electric utility accounts. That covers accounts belonging to 16 agencies. It really impacts any Commonwealth agency that has a portfolio of buildings, located throughout the state. That we have some smaller agencies that occupy space there. So other agencies, but these are typically ones that have, a public presence throughout the Commonwealth. So through that contract, we are retaining the SREC, so we are very much claiming the renewable attributes of the power generated by these installations. And those will be retired in our name. The total amount of energy we expect to get from these installations, it's about 50% of our annual electric consumption. As some of you are aware, the Executive Order 19-01 establishes a goal of 40%. We're at 50 with this 100% in-state solar. It's about, well, I think the analogy of going from like a Geo Metro to like a Cadillac Escalade is probably an understatement. We've been buying 40% of our energy use the last 5 or 6 years from just national wind sources, Green E certified national wind sources. And then this is very much at least in our view, a very significant upgrade. And we're very pleased with how this has worked out in that regard. So a little bit about why we chose to do, at least for us, and these are unique situations for us or our unique circumstances, why we decided to go with a retail contract instead of the traditional virtual PPA through the wholesale market. It was mainly driven by administrative efficiencies. And not to pick on Penn State, or at least we'll use them as an example. They entered into a virtual PPA through the wholesale market. Their recent project that they underwent with Lightsource BP. I believe Penn State, for the most part, has a few large electric accounts. I'm not sure how many are involved in that, and the wholesale PPA probably makes a whole lot of sense for them, given the way that they're metered and set up. But for us, given that we're talking about 434 different accounts, it's just really administratively, there's a lot of barriers to us entering into a wholesale contract for that, because there you're talking about adding separate invoices. You lose the capability to have your bills or your electric supply costs billed through your utility bill. When you go wholesale, you have to handle things differently. And we might have been able to do it on less than 434 invoices, but the prospect of potentially having 434 additional monthly electric invoices wasn't real attractive to our comptrollers group. So that was really one of the primary reasons we wanted to go retail. The other side of that is it's less risky, and really how you structure your contract can dictate a lot of that. But we mainly went with a fixed price for 15 years. It's probably about 98.5% of a fixed price for a 15-year contract, and we got half decent pricing. So that's a pretty good. I don't want to use the word hedge, because we kind of get dirty looks from folks when we start talking about hedges and risk management and things. The government and hedging does not really go hand in hand. At least, it just implies that you're, outplaying the market, and that's really not what we're doing. But that's what it is. We have a 15-year price hedge, fixed price hedge on, I'd say 98% of our price for these utility accounts, and that was real attractive to us. And we're not subject to the wholesale market and like the whims of the hourly pricing that oftentimes you have to do if you're doing a wholesale transaction. All right, so that's all we have, and we thank you for your participation and for listening to what we have to say. I'll turn it back over to Matt for the Q&A.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Greg and Devin.